Robin isn't a blues man per se, but obviously he's had a brush with music later on. Let's find out a little bit about him. First of all, a personal question, Robin. Tell us how, when, under what circumstances you first heard music, and really music of a meaningful nature. That means rock, or jazz, or blues. But no country, right?
I was about 5 or 6. Lord Rockingham's 11, Boots Mon, who were a novelty band from, well, I don't know where they were from Scotland, but Boots Mon was an unbelievably patronising piece of music. Boots Mon, there's a moose loose around this hoose, which is a 5-year-old. I thought was irresistible. But after that came some more interesting stuff. Johnny and the Hurricanes, who were a sax-driven band from the States, who did 1 or 2 really nice, slightly funky things. But the revelation was a band called the Piltdown Men, who were late 50s and were a bunch of session men for Capitol Records in the States, I later found out, apparently pilled out of their tiny brains on every session. They went on to do a lot of lounge music as well. But what distinguished the Piltdown Men was a fantastic piano action. It was very boogie driven. And I found later on there was 1 track, they only did about 5 singles, and 1 guy is still making music now, Lincoln Mayorga, who was their main arranger. But there's a track called Bubbles in the Tar by the Piltdown Men, which I'm sure you can dig out on YouTube. And it's the most outrageous, bluesy piano figure. I just loved it to pieces. And years later, I got a Fats Domino compilation listing the great man's career from 1949 onwards. And the first thing he cut was in 1949, and it was that same piano figure. His first song was called The Fat Man. So clearly these boys in LA had heard that, we're going to pitch that 10 years later. And it went on from there. After that it was always instrumental bands for a while, but the next big one was Booker T and the MGs. And if you get into soul music and you dig around, then you're going to get into R&B. And if you're going to get into R&B, chances are it will also lead you to the blues. And I was telling Jim, because I said, well, am I going to be talking about the blues? And I will a little, because I think it's a fascinating topic. A little. The way it has flown around and survived and mutated and grown. And I think there's some interesting stuff that happens to the blues in the UK in the late 60s, which I'll come to. But the thing which I thought was most interesting about what's happening with the blues now is that it's a global thing. It's everywhere. There are, wonderful blues players in Denmark, and there's bands like the Tedeschi Trucks Band who are coming to the UK, I think in February of next year, and I'm going to go and see their gig. They're a 12-piece band in the grand American tradition, but a lot of their stuff is shot through with the blues. That tradition hasn't gone away, but the paths in which it reached us. For anyone of approximately my age, I'm a 70-year-old baby boomer, you might remember that Pi Records issued a budget label called Marble Arch, and they sold albums for 12 and 6, or 62.5p. And the Pi Records at the time had the rights to everything on chess. So you could get Chuck Berry albums for 60p, Howling Wolf, things like that. And that was a revelation, and I'm pretty sure that if kids like me were buying it, then kids like the Rolling Stones were buying those albums too, because we're approximately the same age. And it also reminds me of the kind of stuff that was made available to us in the late 60s. It was country blues. You've got people like Brother John Sellers coming over. You've got people like Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee who toured colleges in the late 60s extensively. And that was definitely rural blues. And they were very much good time. Everything's fine. So they came and played my university, which was York University. They were just genial, dispensing of great goodwill and bonhomie, and everyone had a good time. Light years away from the deprivation of blues. It was And that's one of the interesting points that I do want to hammer on, but I won't spend too long on it. That blues came out of deprivation, it came out of exploitation, it came out of a falling lifestyle. There are slavery elements in it. Stuff that we can't begin to understand because we're nice, cosseted, largely, looking around the room, largely liberal white folk. And so when you break down the elements of the blues, first off there's the gut feel of it. You've got the visceral appeal of it. And you also have a strong sexual element. And there's a certain, sometimes, depending on the artist, there's a certain amount of boasting and braggadocio. English kids got that right away. If you think about Zeppelin, and you know, I forget which song it was, but Zeppelin quotes from a fairly rude blues track. You know, there's Plant saying, "Squeeze my lemon till the juice runs down my leg," and that's a blues line. But the way he put it together, he was a sexual rock god, because that's how the blues was presented at that time. And you know what? That was re-exported to the United States, which I think is an ironic thing. My first radio job, paid radio job, was working in America. I worked for 13 months on a station called WPHD FM in Buffalo, New York, which is the arts end of the state. And it was a declining industrial city. The steelworks had closed. I mean, the parallels with Round Oak and Bethlehem Steel are amazing. And what happened in those 2 years was very interesting, in 71 to 72. So at that time, basically the core of classic rock, what we now define as classic rock, came out. So you have Stairway to Heaven, you have the Stones XL on Main Street, you had music from the Faces, you had music from Free still, because I don't think Bad Company had started up, and so on and so on. But what also happened quite a lot were albums called the London Sessions. Does anyone remember the London Session albums? There was stuff that was done with Muddy Waters. I'm not sure whether B.B. King did one, because he already had his act together. But what would happen is these blues guys would come over and they'd be put in a studio for a week or so in London, and everybody would flock to record with them. And the first 2 or 3 were really quite good. And then after that, I think it didn't quite work. And to a certain degree, that was partly the kind of thing that you had done a few years previously, except you didn't record the guys, but you brought bluesmen over to tour in this country. And I wound up interviewing half a dozen of them when I came to the RMB.
That's right. We actually did record them, but not with the prominence of the London Sessions. Winwood was on those, wasn't he? Steve Winwood.
Oh, excellent.
And Bo Diddley, of course. So.
Fabulous. So,
sorry to interrupt, Carol.
Not at all, no, I'm just interested. And so I always felt it's slightly embarrassing, you know, because years later I got to interview B.B. King. Fantastic. I was so excited. And I was so nervous because you know, he'd done stuff like, oh, Ain't Nobody Home. He'd done Why I Sing the Blues, which was really laid out beautifully, and you know, The Thrill Is Gone, and also his showmanship and his stagecraft was phenomenal, and he'd really honed his act perfectly, and I was sitting there quivering, nervous. And I must have been, I don't know, the 200th quivering, nervous little white boy coming to talk to him. But he was very kind, and gave me a beautifully prepped interview. I mean, I interviewed an awful lot of people working at the RMB as a job for about 10 years, and he delivered good interviews. I mean, there were people whom you wanted to get stuff from, and you knew you weren't going to get it. Paul McCartney delivers a great interview, but he never gives anything away. It's just, you know, he gives the nice, homely answers, and everyone's happy, but he hasn't said anything about himself whatsoever. And I didn't actually have the nerve to push B.B. King saying, tell me about deprivation, because that would be so tactless. It does remind me of something else. There's the late Alan Toussaint, who is also connected with the blues, because he was the force with 2 or 3 other people behind the whole New Orleans music, and his associations with all these classic R&B hits. The list goes on forever. And he recorded an album in about 1975 called Southern Nights. And it landed at the R&B, and I loved it to pieces. It's very elegant, beautifully constructed songs. There's some very chugging R&B on it. There's also some very lyrical love ballads. And the lead song is Southern Nights. It's about how lovely nights down in South America are. I went to see him play. I was at that time I was in America, I'm jumping around all over the place. This was in between, it had to be a couple of years after Hurricane Katrina. And Toussaint came up every month and he played a room about this size as a benefit for the victims of Hurricane Katrina. And it was $20 to go and see him, and it was a bargain. It was just Toussaint telling stories through the grand piano, very gentlemanly, very stately. And the closing number that he did, he started this lilting, rocking, comforting riff. And eventually the whole room was swaying back and forth. It just seduced the entire room into this wonderful rhythm. And he extemporized over that, about what it was like when he was a kid. And remember, at this point, Toussaint was probably about 70, 75. And he's talking about 70 years previously, going to stay with his backcountry cousins back in the bayou in Louisiana. No electricity, no running water, no nothing. They had to go to the well to get their water. If you had to go if you wanted to go to the toilet at night, you had to be really careful because there was no light. You had to take a lamp with you, and you worried that you were going to get bitten by something. And you had the torn up Sears catalog to wipe your butt after you'd been to the toilet. So he was basically very gently painting a very precise picture of deprivation, the likes of which none of us in this room will ever experience. Just breathtakingly poor. These were older members of his family who didn't even really speak English that much. They spoke this kind of patois, which had developed down in Louisiana from people who settled there. And there's a lot of French left in it. It was a whole other world, but it was a world with no money, no nothing, no luxuries, and back-breaking work, no air conditioning, and it was all hot and sticky. And so that was a very brilliant, elegant way of telling what their lives were like. And I also think he did it quite deliberately, because Glenn Campbell covered that song. And it was hokey about how fantastic it was down south, with banjos playing and all those cicadas singing, nothing about poverty. So it was actually a crass reinterpretation, which is also one of the interesting things about how sometimes white artists have done very crass reinterpretations of the blues. If you think about, I think it was Pat Boone covering Fats Domino. It was just appallingly bad kind of material. But he didn't mention Glenn Campbell, but I think the point was very clear. And it did reinforce the thing about, do we get the blues? And I can't think now we do, in the same way that music is available worldwide, wherever you go. All you have to do is pull up Spotify or YouTube, type in what you're looking for, bingo, there it is. It's very rare that you can't find stuff now. And I think that's had a huge effect on how pop music is made these days, how people are able to deliver stuff with credibility. I was talking yesterday with a producer who's an Indian guy called Simon Dougal, who is King's Heath based, and he's got a fantastic track record. I was talking with him, can I plug my podcast? Yeah. Okay, he's going to be in series 2 of my podcast, which is called Lives in Music, which is about people who spent their lives in music. Jim's been on this in series 1. So Simon's going to be in series 2. And Simon's track record is amazing. He and his brother produced the first hit for Apache Indian almost as an accident, called Ruby Over India, which was this huge underground hit. They advertised it on the old pirate station PCRL, And it only happened because they had to press up 500 copies to get a vinyl. And so then sold out, and then sold another 1,500, another 2,000, and on it went from there. And that launched Apache Indian's career. But he was talking about the credibility of music making, and he cited Sweden. And I think the really nice singer from Roxette died this week. That was a shame because she was an excellent, excellent singer. But if you think about the competence of Sweden in producing phenomenally good pop music, we'd have never imagined that possible 15, 20, 30 years ago. But if you think about the craft that ABBA brought to what they were doing, you think about the current singer-songwriters who are massively in demand, and that just illustrates how worldwide things can go. If you think about the guys, I'm trying to think of the connections here. There was an Australian band called the Easy Beats who had a hit called Friday on My Mind. And Vander and Young were that. Young was the family name for Angus Young, who sang lead in AC/DC, and they were originally the producers, and they were the first thing to really break out of Australia, but an awful lot of other brilliant stuff's come from down there as well. It happens worldwide. So it's interesting because I think Britain is no longer the country that absolutely rules the world in terms of pop music. It's fascinating because I got my first radio job because I was British, because I had an English accent. And it was working on a rock station when the Beatles and the Stones and Zeppelin actually mattered. Years later, I went back and worked for approximately 10 years for a radio software house. And that was from 2000 to about 2009, I was working for them, based here, but going over there every 3 months to work on projects with them, and the rest of the time I did it from home. And talking with them about what mattered musically, and it was so obvious that what we had done back in the day no longer mattered. It wasn't remotely relevant. Things had changed under all recognition. But, so there we are.
Robin, can I bring you back to Birmingham?
I'm going all over the place.
I think I first met you when you first arrived from Buffalo. I went to when you started BRNB. Well, you started there in 73?
I was hired in 73, and the station went on the air February 19th, 1974. I did my first shift that day. My guests were Bev Bevan and Jeff Lynne.
That's a very
very kind of them to come into this fledgling radio station. It was a very nice gesture.
BRNB became really, really valuable to musicians in this region. And one of the reasons was all the live sessions that you did and you produced, because let's go back to that era.
Okay.
Which was the first band you actually recorded for radio?
We recorded the Sleepy Beatles band playing at the Incognito.
Incognito? Is that the Hippodrome?
It's the basement of the Hippodrome. It's not there now. And it was a Saturday lunchtime residency. And it was pretty much the classic Steve Givens band lineup. So Bob Lang was on drums, I think. At that point, it might have been someone else. We then had Trevor Burton on bass, Dave Carroll and Bob Wilson twin guitars, and Steve up front. And of course, I know you've had Bob Wilson in here.
Oh, he's a regular here, yeah.
And in fact, he's on my list for lives in music as well, but I'm trying to nail that guy down.
Off topic a little. Ask him about his tour he did with a Canadian harmonica player called the King Biscuit Boy. He did 7 weeks for me on that tour, playing Jeff Lynne's piano, and he has no recall whatever.
I'm not surprised.
Those 7 weeks.
I'm not surprised. There was a point when BRNB was desperately trying to get its license renewed. The stations got awarded 7-year licenses back in those days, and then they had to compete to had to be really virtuous to get the license back. So they do all these, look at us, we're wonderful, response to the CDSO and all that kind of stuff. And BRNB stepped up saying there was going to be a European Broadcasting Union, the same people who do Eurovision. It's going to be an EBU rock festival in Nuremberg, in Germany. And BRNB volunteered to sponsor a band. And they came to me, said, who should we send? And I said, well, Ruby Turner, please. And they said, okay. So off we went, and I tour managed Ruby Turner out to Nuremberg and back. And Ruby was fine. He's perfectly. Bob Wilson, however, we flew to Frankfurt, took the S-Bahn into Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, where we then connected to a train down to Nuremberg. And I turned around, I'd given everyone their train tickets, and I turned around, bloody hell, where's Wilson gone? And also Billy Paul, and I forget who the third guy was, but half the band had disappeared into a bar in the station. And I thought, well, they've got their tickets, I don't know what I can do, I can't find them, we've got to catch this train. They turned up much later that night, and the next day, Bob had given them all their per diems. They had a small allowance each day to go and buy this, that, and the other. Bob had blown the lot that first night. He was feeling just a little bit rough. And I shall remind him of that.
He always played impeccably.
His playing is fantastic. There's a live Ruby Turner recording, which I think they did at Cannon Hill, and Bob's got a solo on that, and he takes it higher and higher. It's just amazing, outrageous.
You sort of saw the emergence of bands like the L Pairs, Two-Tone, UB40?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that in those days, this is how much the industry has changed. In those days, stations had a budget to be spent on the employment of musicians. 3% of turnover, I think, it might be 3% of profits. But it meant that B&B had a goodly sum to spend, maybe 80 grand a year. And again, most of that went to the CDSO, which I don't regret, because the CDSO at that point were just coming into their prime under Simon Rattle and turning basically into the finest classical band in the country. I have another podcast about that coming up in Series 2 of Lives in Music with a 40-year veteran fiddle player with the band, who's got some incredible stories. But anyway, that money went to pay for things like jingle packages, obviously. And at one point they were fiddling things something rotten, and my salary came out of that budget, which is not exactly right. But I still was able to get fees to record sessions, and those sessions tended to be 3-hour efforts. Across the road there was a studio called Outlaw Studios.
Phil Savage.
Phil Savage's place, which was damp and smelly and cold, like a lot of those multi-track studios. It was an 8-track studio. It wasn't even 16-track, 8-track. And we did a 3-hour session. We had the specials. Specials, first broadcast came on my watch at the RMB. And we did Selector as well at the same place. We were going to do the beat, but suddenly John Peel wanted them, so goodbye. The most distinguished, successful, extraordinarily successful session was basically an early mix of the UB40 Signing Off album, which was being done on a 4-track in a bedsit in King's Heath in Cambridge Road, in Bob Lamb's bedsit. And I said, give me an early mix and I will pay you a full session rate, and an item session rate, which basically means you've got the rights to play everything 6 times, and you had to pay a fee to each musician, plus porterage for their instrument. I don't know about these deals, but basically it meant that instead of a £200 fee for a band, which was actually rather nice in those days for most bands who were still playing pubs, the UB's got about 800 quid. They actually bought a van off the proceeds, and they were delighted. But I was delighted too, because the reaction was, it just took off like a rocket. What the UBs had been doing was early viral marketing. First off, they fly posted about themselves all over town. They were cocky little bastards. And sorry to come back to this, but I interviewed Brian Travers last week, again, for my podcast series number 2, and he was talking about all this. And so they would go into pubs and say, hey, have you heard of this band UB40? Fucking brilliant. Spreading the word that way themselves. Early viral marketing. They were very clever. But in fact, they were also very good. Even though they were young and nervous, and it's interesting that if you listen to Brian Travers now, bless him, listen to his playing. It's rich, it's fat. He's been playing sax for 40 years. He's got those muscles in his throat, that strength. Despite the fact that he's not a well man at the moment, he's still playing. And he's got this fantastic rich tone, as well as some rather tasty saxophones to play on, the lumps of metal he was given when he was a kid. But if you listen to the early UB40 signing off, and you listen to the sax tone, bless him, Brian's got this, and he owns up to it, he's got this very tight little sound to his throat. It's not like open and relaxed, which he has now, together with an awful lot of muscle and a lot of gut strength that he delivers.
So how many sessions, live sessions, do you think you did over those years?
I would probably do 2 a month. And you know, people like Ricky Poole, some guys we missed out on. I mean, I missed out on Apache Indian, and I think that's got a lot to do with how well the station was connected. I didn't do anything which I should have done with Steel Pulse, but that happened very, very quickly.
How many sessions do you think?
I would say probably about 30 or 40. Some of these, nothing happened. Nothing happened at all.
I can't help but feel it, because if someone still has the rights to those, what a treasure trove of music that would represent.
I would say the artists have the rights to them, although technically the station would have the rights to them, were the tapes to still exist. And this is one of the most obscene things about the world of recording from 30 or 40 years ago. Reel-to-reel tape was very expensive in real times. You know, a 10.5-inch reel, which would give you half an hour's recording if you were using 15 inches per second speed, or 15 minutes if you're running at 30 for the best quality. That cost about 15 to 20 quid. Yeah, it's for half an hour storage. And if you consider now that you can buy a terabyte of storage for 25 quid, and you'll never bloody fill it, you know. I bought myself a 350 quid cheapo HP laptop, to which I'm still working on. It's about 4 years old now. And I've done a ton of music work on it. But in that time, I've been setting up not 1, but 2 different radio stations. It's all come through that laptop. It's only half full now. It is just ridiculous. So, stations, hold on, I have to, this is the criminal thing. Stations recycled tape. So we lost that Steve Gibbons tape. We lost the UB40 tape. We lost the Specials tape. It was all recycled and criminal, quite frankly.
Was it common practice to reuse the same tape then? Just
very, because it was so expensive. It was ludicrously expensive in comparison to the storage which we now have. The BBC were just as guilty. They threw vast amounts of stuff away. I mean, I worked for the BBC for 5 years after BRMB, and there was stuff going into skips, and I think, how can you be doing this? You know, painstakingly made Radio 4 documentaries. They should have held on to part of our culture.
Absolutely. Also, film as well, but Early Morton and Wise.
Yes.
But we're running a little short of time. Tell me what you did at the BBC. You were 5 years there, aren't you?
5 years, yes. After BRMB, what happened with BRMB was they got bought out about 3 or 4 times. And about the 4th time, I thought, well, I'm probably not going to survive this, because this time it's Capital, who now own Global, who are one of the big groups in the country. And I was right. I got bounced out just when I pushed the audience figures up rather nicely. And so I went off consulting, and I did stuff for different stations. I consulted all the Swedish local radio stations on their music programming using the software that I knew. And then a wonderful man called Geoffrey Hewitt, who was the head of specialist music at BBC Pebble Mill, responsible for an awful lot of Radio 2's output, said, come and produce Radio 2 overnight using automated kit if you can. I said, yes, please. So it was me and a team of 1.5 people doing the overnight shows, a quarter of Radio 2's output out of Pebble Mill. And I did that for 5 years, and it was fantastic. And we had great presenters, none of whom are still working for Radio 2 now. But it was the start of Radio 2's big leap forward from being this kind of main art station to, you know, a kind of racy 45-year-old. So that lasted for a while, but there's again a pattern that's developing here. London didn't like Birmingham's success. They resented Pebble Mill because they produced stuff cheaper. And Radio 2 in particular resented this bunch of people from north of Watford performing better than they did. They could have used the software and I would have explained it all to them, but they didn't want to do that. So that ended. And I wound up after that consulting yet more stations back to Sweden. 5 years working with the Irish National Classical Station, which was a total joy. This is a radio station full of people who played instruments. You do not normally get DJs who know anything about music except, oh, I like that. But these guys could play, and you could understand, you know, when you put a set together, you're going to open with a cracking song, you're going to follow up with a cracking song, you might mellow it down, introduce something, you know, yeah. Well, put your shows together the same way. It was wonderful. And they're in terrible shape at the moment, sadly, because of, again, funding for state radio. And it's gone on lots of other stations. I must have worked at about 60 or 70 stations all across Europe. Monte Carlo, which was soul destroying, and other places like Bulgaria, which was completely, entirely different than AM. And then after that, it was 10 years doing stuff for the software house in New York, followed by more bits and pieces. The last radio gig was setting up the database for Scala Radio, which is Bauer Media's competition to Classic FM.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Yes,
Hand is waving.
Yeah.
Chris.
I hasten to mention the word punk in a room like this, but on your website, I was reading about band 1970s punk called the was it Neon Hearts, I think it was.
Oh yes.
It's suddenly become very big in Japan.
Bless them.
Who just revived after however long. Do you see that as a growing thing now, that bands who were popular way back that no one can even remember will suddenly become cult somewhere else?
Sometimes, but it's very rarely. The Neon Hot story was fascinating. It was this kind of slightly shambolic punk band. One of them's dead now, but they became a cult in Japan. Now, I cannot explain how things become cults in Japan, because the thing that excites Japanese is not necessarily our sense of logic. But I was very happy for them. They reformed, they did a nice tour playing to their fans. In fact, one of the things that they pressed a single, and then they had a printer do the sleeve for them, and the printer got the dimensions wrong. It was a 7-inch single in an 8-inch sleeve. That is being bootlegged in Japan. You can buy brand new versions of that 8-inch sleeve. I was very happy for them, because you never know what's going to happen. One of the lovely things about, if you do something good, chances are it won't be recognized, but sometimes it echoes down the years and sometimes someone picks up on it. And that's a gorgeous thing, it really is. So I was very pleased for them. Punk was very interesting, however. I remember, have you had Pete Hammond down here?
No.
Pete plays with Steve Ajay, and he also played with Rhino and the Rantos. Does anyone know Rhino and the Rantos? Lovely, mostly dead band. Yes, they have, sadly, but he's still with Steve Ajay. Pete used to play in the Au Pairs, who were, I was terrified of the Au Pairs because they were so politically correct. And I was working for horrible capitalist commercial radio, so I couldn't defend myself. I told this to Pete, he said, that's great, I was really pleased. Very nice.
Well, that's been most entertaining. 25 minutes has been flashed by. Let's show our appreciation, please, to Robin Valk. One more.
I can just create one thing. If you're at all interested in the blatant plugging I've been doing for the Lives in Music podcast series, go to Spotify, search Lives in Music. There's 10 interviews with people about their lives in music. Stevie Jones on there, Ruby Turner is on there. There's a whole range of interesting people, and I'd love it if you listen. Thank you.